Good afternoon, everyone. We have the signal to begin. If you don't know me already, my name is Michael Taylor, and I'm the director of the Hood Museum of Art at Dartmouth College, and it gives me immense pleasure to welcome you to this evening's opening celebrations for two exhibitions, About Face, Self-Portraiture in Contemporary Art, and Poseidon and the Sea, Myth, Cult, and Daily Life. We're going to begin with the About Face show. This was organized in collaboration with 9 Dartmouth College students, and it explores the extraordinary range and global diversity of self-portraiture in recent contemporary art. This project offered these students a unique opportunity to learn more about curatorial practice through the planning and execution of this exhibition. Each student chose to research and write at least one or more object labels for the works of art on display, and I do hope that you will visit About Face and read their extraordinary and deeply insightful texts after this afternoon's talk. I would like to thank the following students for their participation in this collaborative project, many of whom have braved the elements and are here with us tonight. So please stand up if you hear your name. Adria Brown, class of 2015. Bay Loris Burns-Sim, class of 2015. Laura Dawn, class of 2015. Olivia Field, class of 2015. Singer Horsecapture, class of 2017. Alexandra Johnson, class of 2017. Malika Kurana, class of 2015. Taylor Payer, class of 2015. And Alyssa Waters, class of 2015. Thank you so much for all the great work that you did. Let's give them a round of applause. I would also like to mention that Laura Dawn and Jordan Craig from the class of 2015 have organized a related exhibition entitled About Dartmouth Face that will open next Thursday, February the 5th at 6:15 p.m. in the Student Gallery at the Black Family Visual Arts Center. It's sponsored by the great class of 1960, right, Rick Rush? This exhibition of self-portraits by Dartmouth students from across the campus is not to be missed. Now, this afternoon's lecture relates to our other exhibition this term, namely Poseidon and the Sea, and will be followed by a reception in the King Gallery, during which you can see both exhibitions. There is also a half-day symposium related to the Poseidon and the Sea exhibition, which will begin tomorrow at 10 a.m. in this same auditorium. This wonderful exhibition was organized by the Tampa Museum of Art, and its presentation at the Hood has been generously supported by Claire Forster and Daniel Bernstein, class of 1987, as well as the Eleanor Smith Fund, the Evelyn A.J. Hall Fund, and the Mary Louise and Samuel R. Rosenthal Fund. We are particularly grateful for Dan and Claire's support of these opening events and tomorrow's symposium. Before I introduce Seth Pevnik, from the great class of 1999, the curator of the Poseidon and the Sea exhibition, I would like to take this opportunity to recognize a number of people who have made this project possible. First of all, I would like to thank our Tampa Museum of Art colleagues, Amanda Seidler, Exhibitions and Collections Manager, and Bob Hellier, Designer and Preparator, who worked closely with us to prepare the exhibition for the Hood venue, including the installation which they so thoughtfully oversaw. At the Hood, I would like to express our deep gratitude to our registrar, Kathleen O'Malley, for her superb orchestration of the logistics of this exhibition, which required 12 lender couriers, as well as the travel, unpacking, and installation of the objects themselves. Others who were instrumental in making this exhibition possible include Patrick Dunphy, exhibition designer, John Reynolds, preparator, who built a number of the exhibition pedestals, Matt Zayatz, preparator, Cynthia Gilliland, associate registrar, Nikki Williams, exhibitions coordinator, Essie Ronco, curatorial assistant and art handler, and Kathy Hart, the indomitable Kathy Hart, the exhibition's curatorial coordinator. Finally, I would like to thank Juliette Bianco, who shared with me a dream of keeping our exhibition program alive while we were preparing to undergo a major expansion. As many of you know, the Hood will close in December of this year, and be closed for 2 years for an expansion project that will see us add new classrooms, galleries, and a really superb entrance with visitor services. So we're very excited about that, but what we really wanted to do was keep the quality and standards that we've had over the years throughout this exhibition season and through December. And Juliet, you've done such an incredible job of keeping us on track. I would also like to thank members of the Art History and Classics Department for their contribution to the programming of this exhibition, and the scholars who are here to speak at tomorrow's event: Jennifer Niels, Margaret Miles, William Murray, and Sarah Murray. We welcome you to Dartmouth College and look forward to hearing your talks on topics related to the themes of the exhibition tomorrow. Finally, I would like to thank Seth Pethnick, the curator of Poseidon and the Sea and the driving intellectual force behind the selection and arrangement of the objects in this landmark exhibition and the contents of its accompanying catalogue. We also thank Seth for agreeing to deliver this afternoon's keynote address. Seth D. Pethnick is the acting director, chief curator, and Richard E. Perry curator of Greek and Roman art at the Tampa Museum of Art, where he has worked since 2009. He received his undergraduate degree in classics and graduated magna cum laude from Dartmouth College in 1999. 3 years later, in 2002, he received a master's in elementary education from Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. He went on to study at the University of California, Los Angeles, where he received his PhD in art history in 2011. The title of his dissertation was Foreign Creations of the Athenian Keramikos. Like many classical scholars, he has traveled to Greece on numerous occasions to study at the American School of Classical Studies in Athens, where he was the John William White Fellow in 2008. At the Tampa Museum of Art, he has organized 3 permanent collection exhibitions: From Life to Death in the Ancient World in 2010, Worlds Apart, Myth and History, Gods and Mortals, Heroes and Hybrids in 2011, and finally Utility and Aesthetics in Ancient Art in 2012. Clearly Seth knows a bit about exhibition titles because they're all excellent. In 2008-09, he served as a curatorial assistant in the Antiquities Department at the J. Paul Getty Museum in Los Angeles. In addition to his work on the volume for this exhibition and other scholarly articles, he recently submitted an article to the edited volume on Athenian potters and painters titled Good Dog, Bad Dog, a cut by the Triptolemus painter and aspects of canine behavior on Athenian vases, which will appeal to classics lovers and dog lovers everywhere. He is currently working on an essay entitled Attic Black Figure and Red Figure Pottery from Methone for a volume on recent excavations at a site where he was a ceramic consultant in 2013. And over the past 2 decades, I should say, he's done extensive field work and a number of other excavations in Greece and Albania. Please join me in welcoming Seth, who will give his lecture this evening on the making of the Poseidon and the Sea exhibition and its themes of myth, culture, daily life, and seafaring. Seth Pethnick.
Thank you very much, Michael, for that kind and probably too generous introduction. I hope I can live up to it. And thank you all for coming out tonight. It really is a special honor for me to be here as a graduate of the college and as a former intern at the Hood Museum. In many ways, I see this as sort of coming full circle because I started my museum career, I guess 16 years ago when I was the senior coin intern at the Hood Museum. And I need to thank Professor Stewart for that if she's here. She was my supervisor during that time. I should also thank Kathy Hart and Professor Rudder and Professor Ulrich and everyone else who did so much to help me along during my student days here at Dartmouth. And also Michael Taylor and all of the wonderful staff members at the Hood who, as he said, did a tremendous job in making this exhibition possible. From my perspective, I want to reiterate also the thanks to Juliet Bianco, because it was about a year ago I had just returned to Tampa from Omaha, where this exhibition opened at the Joslin Art Museum. And it was to follow at the Tampa Museum of Art over the summer and fall, and we had been hoping for a third venue, and the third venue that we had in mind decided that they were no longer interested. And we were intent on persevering and carrying on, and we got this phone call from Juliet asking whether it might be possible to send the exhibition to Hanover. And I thought that perhaps she was joking, because it really seemed to me too good to be true. But she wasn't joking, and thankfully we were able to make it happen. One group of people that I also need to thank is the lenders. We had nearly 30 lenders to this exhibition, and when Juliet and Kathy and Michael inquired about bringing the exhibition here, it was easy for me to say yes, but then I needed all of those 30 lenders to also say, yes, it's okay if you extend our loans for an additional 3 or 4 months, and thankfully nearly every one of them did. So a few of those lenders are here in the audience, and I want to thank them, and those who aren't here we need to thank as well. And now to get to the lecture, this is one, as you can probably imagine, that I've given a number of times in Omaha and in Tampa and in several other places as well. But I'll tell you from the beginning, it breaks down into 5 parts, really. The beginning is about Poseidon, the god, generally, who he was, why he's important. The second part is about this wonderful statue of Poseidon that you see here and that you'll see upstairs if you haven't already. And then the 3 themes of the exhibition: myth, cult, and daily life. And I should be clear from the beginning that I've divided them into these 3 themes because that sort of makes it convenient when you're laying out an exhibition. And especially here at the Hood Museum, the exhibition is spread across 3 different galleries, and it fits very neatly, and I think it's a lovely, lovely installation upstairs. But a lot of these divisions between myth, cult, and daily life are rather subjective ones, and many of the objects that are on view upstairs would be equally at home in a different gallery had I decided that aspect of the object was more important. I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail for some of the objects, and for others I ask you just to bear that in mind. So we start with the Homeric hymn to Poseidon. And I know you all can read, but it's such a lovely hymn, I'm going to read it to you. I begin to sing about Poseidon, the great god, mover of the earth and fruitless sea, god of the deep, who is also lord of Helicon and wide Aigai. A 2-fold office the gods allotted you, O shaker of the earth, to be a tamer of horses and a savior of ships. Hail, Poseidon, holder of the earth, dark-haired lord. O blessed one, be kindly in heart and help those who voyage in ships. So based on that hymn, which is very, very well known, I think you can see that Poseidon is more than just the god of the sea. That's what he's most famous for today. Everybody knows that Poseidon is the god of the sea, but he's much more than that. He's also the shaker of the earth. That means he's responsible literally for shaking the earth. If you've spent any time in Greece or Italy or other parts of the Mediterranean, you know that's very important. It's an earthquake zone, and according to some people at least, Poseidon is the one who's responsible for that. We'll come back to this image in a little bit. He's also a tamer of horses and a savior of ships. It makes sense that he's the savior of ships, of course, since he's the god of the sea, but he's also the tamer of horses, by some accounts even the inventor of horses or the creator of horses. And for that reason, we often see him accompanied or riding on this fantastic creature that you see here. This is a drawing of what wraps around this black figure vase from Yale, and it's what we call a hippocamp. It's a horse in the front with a long fish tail and some dolphins in the back. In case you weren't certain that he's in the sea, the artist has added that in for you. And this is a particularly spectacular hippocamp because it has wings, which they don't always have. So we know Poseidon is this important god. He thinks, perhaps, that he's even more important than you might have thought or than some of the other gods would contend. And this is a quotation from the Iliad, and this is Poseidon speaking. And he says, "All was divided among us 3 ways, each given his domain. I, when the lots were shaken, drew the gray sea to live in forever. Hades drew the lot of the mists and the darkness, and Zeus was allotted the wide sky in the clouds and the bright air. But earth and high Olympus are common to all 3. So these are the three eldest of the generation of gods that are the eldest of the Olympians. And Zeus, of course, is known as the king of these gods. Poseidon is also counted among the Olympians. Hades is not always counted among them, but is of that generation. And the important part of this quote is that Earth and Olympus are common to all three. So for Poseidon, at least, he's just as important as these other gods. Now, to get to the statue that inspired it, this statue belongs to the Tampa Museum of Art, and I actually knew of this statue before I came to Tampa. So while I was at the Getty and at UCLA, this opening came up in Tampa, and I applied for the job. And as I was researching the collection to prepare for my interviews, I came up with this idea that they have this great statue of Poseidon. It turns out it's the biggest and best preserved statue of Poseidon or Neptune in the United States. And Tampa, of course, is a city that's on the sea. It has the biggest port in the state of Florida. And I thought, why not put together an exhibition that brings all of these things together? And it took a few years, but eventually it happened. So this is the statue that we start with. And I show you these other views because he's not quite complete, as you can see, but there's no doubt that this is Poseidon. And the clearest giveaway is this dolphin that sits alongside his right leg. There's no other god who would be standing there with a giant dolphin alongside him. And if we continue, I'll show you. I refer to him as Poseidon, but if you look at the label down here or the label upstairs, you can see that I call it a Roman statue from the 1st century. And so therefore people might say, well, why is this Poseidon rather than Neptune? And I'll get to that in a second. This is how he looked about 100 years ago when he was with a dealer in London. These are not ancient parts, I don't think, but repairs that were made probably in the 1700s, but restoring the big trident that he would always have, as well as his other hand. And here's a drawing made after that photograph. But the really exciting thing that I've discovered is about a year ago, a little bit before Juliet called me, I got an email from a scholar in England who was working on this collection at Shugborough Hall in England. And she said, I've just found this drawing, and I wonder if this might be your Poseidon. And the drawing is very interesting, not only because it shows our Poseidon, but also because up here it says Neptune, and down here it says Mr. Anson's. And Mr. Anson was a very, very important English collector. He was one of the founders of the Society of the Dilettanti. He was collecting in the 1700s, and the man who made this sketch is called Joseph Nollekens, and he was also involved with collectors in that period and in restoring ancient statues. And so I think that Mr. Nollekens restored this statue for Mr. Anson, which gives us a much longer modern history for our statue, which I think is important and interesting. But the way that I know that this is our statue is because we have all of these other very similar statues. I told you ours in Tampa is the biggest and best preserved in the United States, but it belongs to this larger group of statues, which you see on the right side of the screen, distributed among a bunch of different museums. The one at the top right in Arles was just pulled out of the Rhone River over several seasons about 10 years ago. So this is a new addition to the group. But all of these statues are similar in size, all carved by Roman sculptors in the 1st or 2nd century AD. And you can see how similar they are to one another, but if you compare them to the drawing in the British Museum, I think you'll agree that it's definitely our statue, the Tampa statue that's shown in this drawing. So that tells us, number one, that ours has this long modern history. But the fact that there's this large group of statues that are also similar to one another suggests that although they were all carved by Roman sculptors, they seem to be harking back to an earlier Greek original. And therefore, I feel comfortable calling our statue Poseidon, the Greek god, because I think it goes back to an earlier Greek statue. And we see other echoes of that earlier Greek statue. None of the statues I just showed you are on view upstairs, only the Tampa one, but these objects are all on view upstairs, and you can see them. different media from different time periods at different scales, but all fairly similar in pose. And so there must have been some famous statue of Poseidon. Some scholars have suggested that it was made by Praxiteles, the famous Greek sculptor in the 4th century BC. We can't be sure. That statue is gone, but we have all of these later echoes of it. So now to get into the rest of the exhibition a little bit more. This, of course, is a map of most of the Mediterranean world. Most of the objects on view upstairs were created in this part of the world. And you can see this great quote from Socrates running along the bottom. "I believe that the earth is very large, and that we who dwell between the pillars of Heracles," that is the Straits of Gibraltar, which are over here, and the river Phasis, which is just off the edge of the map over here, live in a small part of it about the sea, like ants or frogs about a pond. And this is a quote that scholars have seized upon many, many times. And I think it's very telling because it gives you a sense of their worldview, which was very, very different from ours. Especially in the United States, we think of ourselves as living in this great mass of land that's bound on either side by the sea or by these oceans. For the Greeks, it was very, very different, and for the Romans as well. They're living around this great mass of water. And if you look at the sites and how they're distributed, they're all very, very close to the water. So if you think about these peoples who live here, and you think about a god of the sea, he must have been very, very important indeed. And then this is just a quick timeline. I don't want to go through all these objects, but the point is that we're covering a very big land area. We're also covering a very, very long span of time, more than a millennium, over which Poseidon maintains a very, very important place. The way the exhibition is designed is by theme, and so in a given case, you can have objects next to one another that were produced many hundreds of miles apart from one another and many hundreds of years apart from one another, and it's important to keep that in mind. All right, so this is the image that we saw before when I talked about Poseidon as the earth shaker. Like so many of the gods and goddesses of ancient Greece, Poseidon plays important roles in many different myths. This is one of my favorites, and it's the story of the Gigantomachy, the famous battle between the Olympian gods and the race of giants who were trying to overthrow them. And because the Olympians are the ones who maintain order in the world, this would have been devastating. It would have ruined civilization as it stood. And so each god had to play a part in this and battled against a different giant, and Poseidon plays a particularly important role. So this is a detail of this great red figure Cantharos from the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And you can see the quote up at the top from Strabo, who tells us the story. The story basically is that Poseidon is battling this giant, and it's difficult to see in the image, but this giant is bleeding from under his arm, and he's bleeding from his leg because Poseidon has already gotten him a few times with his trident. But in order to finish him off, he has to take his trident and he strikes the island of Kos, which many of you know, off the coast of Turkey in the southeastern Aegean, and breaks off a smaller island called Nisiros and picks it up. So this is not just a boulder that Poseidon is holding, this is a giant island that he's holding. And after he's defeated the giant, who's usually called Polybotes, with his trident, he then buries him under the island of Nisiros. And I haven't had the chance to visit Nisiros, but I'm told that if you go there today, they still have earthquakes occasionally, and that when that happens, people will sometimes say, that's Polybotes under the ground trying to get out. So people sometimes ask, my son especially asks if these stories are true, and I say, well, some people still believe in them, and I think that's an instance of where we can at least play along and say, perhaps this really happened. And we see this not only on that one cup from Boston, but on a number of other vases that are on view upstairs. So a couple of black figure vases, a couple of red figure vases, and then there's this one, which unfortunately we couldn't bring here, but this is in Vienna, and really makes clear that this is an island, because here the rock is populated with little animals. Here's a dolphin and a scorpion and a snake. So it truly is an island that he has lifted out of the sea. But it wasn't only on vases either. It's on this very, very important building, the Parthenon on the Acropolis in Athens. Pretty difficult to see, but on the metopes between the triglyphs up here, we have each metope showing a different dual from the Gigantomachy, and one of these, the highlighted one here, shows Poseidon burying Polybotes with Nisiros. So this is a myth that's very, very important enough to be put on one of the most famous buildings in Greece. We also see Poseidon sometimes just riding along on his hippocamp, and there we can't really be sure what myth is being alluded to, or if this is just the artist deciding he wants to portray Poseidon. This vase from Princeton is the earliest representation that we have in the exhibition. So this dates from about 580 BC. And it's pretty clear that this is Poseidon because he has this trident and he's riding on the hippocamp. Right around the same time period, these are not in the exhibition, but these are good comparisons to that vase from Princeton, because here there can be no doubt that this is Poseidon. This was found at Isthmia, which we'll return to in a little bit, the most famous sanctuary of Poseidon. And this is a plaque, and you can see here it's actually labeled Poteidon, which is the Corinthian way of saying Poseidon. So here there can be no doubt. And these are also from the 6th century BC. And here's one more, and here, instead of the dolphin, he's shown with his horse. And here the label goes backwards, which is fine in the 6th century BC, and it says Poteidon. And he has his trident, and he's riding on the horse. So keep in mind Poseidon, Hippios, Poseidon the god of horses. We also see Poseidon pursuing women. So we have all these famous stories of Zeus seducing women, and Poseidon, in that sense, was no different. He had a wife named Amphitrite, but he also had liaisons with many other women as well. Here he is as Neptune. So this is a Roman mosaic, and you can see with his wife Amphitrite being pulled here by a chariot, pulled by 4 hippocamps. So appropriate for the god of the sea. This hippocamp that we saw in the 6th century BC is still going strong in the Roman period into the 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries AD. Perhaps his most famous son is called Triton, and you see the quote from Hesiod, from the union of rumbling Poseidon and Amphitrite came the great Triton, whose might is far flung, an awesome god, dwelling in a golden house that lies at the sea's bottom, near his cherished mother and lordly father. And we have a number of representations of Triton. This is one of my favorites. This is a silver handle. So the artist has cleverly used the long fishy tail of Triton to form a handle for a wine jug. The jug itself, unfortunately, is missing, but you can imagine him looking out over the wine, sort of keeping guard over it with the one hand, and he probably would have held a trident in this hand. And this is really a spectacular piece. And then we have this great sarcophagus fragment that belongs to the Hood Museum. And several years ago, when I was still working on the show, it was not yet certain it would happen or not, I came up to Hanover for a visit, and we talked about borrowing this for the show. And in the end, it didn't go to Omaha or Tampa. So it's really exciting now that the show is here that it can join. And here we have, unfortunately, he's cut off, but this is what we would call an ichthyocentaur. So he's a man up here and has horse hooves up here, and then the long fishy tail. And here's a more traditional Triton here. And then we have this great bronze Etruscan helmet from Florence. And this applique takes the form of Triton, a really scary-looking Triton. So there's his big face and his fishy tail, and he's holding the body of a warrior. Triton is also very well known for his undersea battle with Heracles, and here's a detail. This is a hydria from the Toledo Museum of Art, one of the best representations we have of this battle. So you can see Poseidon rushing in with his trident and this battle going on. So here's Triton looking to the left, and in the background is Heracles, whom we can identify because of his lion skin cap. So Heracles has his hands wrapped around Triton, and Triton is trying to rip them apart to escape. This is one of these unusual instances where we see this many, many times, particularly on Greek vases. Vase painters were very interested in this battle of Heracles with Triton. But in all the surviving literature we have from ancient Greece and Rome, it's not mentioned. And so we know this was one of the battles that Heracles took part in, but it's not part of his famous 12 labors. And we don't know exactly what the circumstances were or why they were fighting, but it's something that artists really seized upon. And I think partly because Triton is such a fun figure for them to portray. You can see these dolphins diving along underneath Triton to make clear that we're at the bottom of the sea, and then the horses galloping along underneath, sort of echoing the dolphin. People often ask, why is he the god of the sea and the god of the horses? Those seem so different from one another. But occasionally you see juxtapositions like this where they really do sort of seem to go together. And if you think of the crashing of waves and the sound that it makes and the action that it makes, it's perhaps not so different from what horses do. So as I said, he had many love interests and therefore many offspring. And we see a few of them here, and I'm not going to go into great detail for all of them. One of the most famous is Pegasus. So like Triton, this fantastic creature. His most famous son was probably Theseus, and that's who we see here. And Theseus's most famous deed was killing the Minotaur. So you see here the Minotaur, who has this terrible bull's head. I don't know if you can tell here, but he's covered with red spots because he's a monster. And whereas Theseus has this sword, which is a civilized weapon, the Minotaur is using stones. And then occasionally we see Poseidon together with a youth, and we can't really be sure who he is. So on this Etruscan mirror, I should say Nethunes here because it's Etruscan. So this is the Etruscan god of the sea, Nethunes. We can be sure about that because of his trident. And then there's this youth here who has this staff topped with a pomegranate, and we can't be sure who that is. There are a number of myths. This may be another instance, like the Battle of Triton and Heracles, where we don't have a written version, and we just don't know. But then on this great amphora by the Berlin painter from the Metropolitan, we have Poseidon on one side and a youth on the other. This is made around 470 BC, right after the Persian Wars, when Poseidon and Theseus did so much to help the Athenian forces. And so I think it's not unlikely that this is Theseus, the most famous son of Poseidon, on the back. We also sometimes see Poseidon confronting Athena, and it's something that we see for many generations. So we see on this black figure wine jug from Florence, then a couple of centuries later, or a century and a half later, on this little tiny red figure amphora from the Walters, and then on this late Roman coin. So it's something that continues for many, many years. And again, we return to the Parthenon. This is something that at least brings to mind the great scene on the west pediment of the Parthenon, which is the culmination of the contest between Poseidon and Athena for patronage of the city of Athens. They have this race to the top of the Acropolis, and we're told it's virtually a tie. When they reach the top, Poseidon strikes the rock with his trident, and you can still see the spot where he struck it, and a salt spring sprung forth. Athena reached the top and struck the earth, and an olive tree came out. And the Athenians said, we'd much rather have an olive tree than a salt spring. And Athena becomes the most important goddess in Athens. We see it again on this famous red figure Hydria from Pella. And scholars have thought for a long time that this was an invention of the 5th century BC, after Salamis, after Poseidon and Theseus helped the Athenians to defeat the Persians. But there has been some thought recently that perhaps the story predates that, and with vases like this by the Amasis painter, we may be at least referring to that story. All right, so that is the section on myth, and now we're moving into the section on cult. And you can see the quotation from Pausanias, who talks about all the different names that Poseidon can have adorned, added on to his name. And Pelagaios, which refers to his connection to the sea, Asphalios, the secure, the one who keeps people safe, and Hippios, of horses. So Pausanias is telling us that we have all these different places across the ancient world where we can worship Poseidon, but in these three guises, he is most commonly worshipped. And if we zoom in a little bit, I just want to talk briefly about 3 of those sites. So Poseidonia, just south of Naples, now called Paestum, but a city that actually has the name of Poseidon in its city name, so we can well imagine how important he must have been there. Then at Isthmia, along this isthmus which connects the Peloponnese with the Greek mainland, this was the site of the most important sanctuary of Poseidon. So at Isthmia, every 2 years, a great festival was held in honor of Poseidon. And this was part of the athletic circuit for the major athletes of ancient Greece. The Olympics, of course, are the most famous, and those games were held in honor of Zeus. At Delphi, there were games held in honor of Apollo. At Isthmia, there were games held in honor of Poseidon. And then at Nemea, there were games again held in honor of Zeus. So Zeus was perhaps a little bit more held in slightly higher esteem, but this sanctuary is of the highest importance. And then finally, a local sanctuary at Sunion. So Isthmia is a sanctuary, a pan-Hellenic sanctuary where people would come from all over the Greek world for these festivals. Sunion is a local sanctuary where primarily people from Attica, the region around Athens, would worship him. This is the famous temple of Poseidon at Sunion. This is probably the best preserved temple of Poseidon in the present day. And this is basically what it looks like today. There's a great picture of it upstairs in the galleries where you can really see that it really is right on the cape. So there's the sea right there. And in antiquity, as today, as you sail into Piraeus, the port of Athens, this is what you see. Now you see all sorts of hotels and buildings and other things, but in antiquity, this would have been particularly prominent. At Isthmia, unfortunately, the temple is not standing, but archaeologists have excavated there for many, many years and created this great model of what the temple looks like. You can see the foundations if you go there, and there's a lovely museum where you can see some of the finds. But you can see the stadium here where the athletic competitions were held. And we unfortunately do not have the cult statue from that sanctuary, but a lot of scholars think that this is what it looked like. This is known as the Lateran Poseidon because it once belonged to the Lateran collection, now in the Vatican museums. Like the Tampa statue of Poseidon, this is a Roman copy of an earlier Greek original. It has been suggested that the sculptor Lysippus was the creator of the cult statue at Isthmia. And this statue is not upstairs. It would be even bigger than ours and would make ours look a little less important. But we do have all of these other echoes, again, of that pose. It's a pose that scholars refer to as the Lateran pose after this statue. And it's something that we see for many generations, many centuries, even long before the Roman one, of course, because Lysippus created the original, we think, in the 4th century BC. And there's a drawing to show you with his trident, of course. Going back to Poseidonia, this is what the coins look like, and you can see this coin upstairs. This is one of the most famous early Greek coins from the Archaic period. And these are 2 sides of the same coin. So the front has Poseidon standing out in relief, as is typical on coins, and then on the back side, stamped in what we call an incus image. And in both cases, he's labeled POS for Poseidonia. And then probably the most striking object in the exhibition, if you haven't seen it already, is this trident, which is almost as long as this screen. So this is projecting it about life size. This is really a remarkable object. I haven't seen anything quite like it. This is a solid bronze trident, and if you think back to what I was saying about the Tampa statue, that it's a statue without its trident, this is almost certainly a trident without its statue. It's far too big to be a functional trident. If you look at the points on it, they wouldn't really work for spearfishing, and the thing is so large you need at least 2 people to carry it. So Really the only explanation I can come up with is that it was meant to accompany a statue which must have been at least twice life size, so a very, very large statue. This trident, I should add, belongs to the Getty Museum. And when I was working on the show at the very, very beginning, I knew of the trident because every time I went into the bronze storeroom at the Getty, I would see this huge wooden box and it said Trident on it. And I always wanted to see the trident because I had never seen one like that anywhere else. And I had looked in the files and looked in the database, but looking at a little black and white photo is nothing like actually seeing the thing. And so I convinced my colleagues there to take it down and open up the crate, and everyone sort of oohed and ahed. And we said, wouldn't it be great if this could be in the exhibition? But it's a little bit more complicated than that. So then they had to study it to make sure it was safe to travel. Initially, they wanted to keep it under glass, like most of the objects, so that they could keep it in a microclimate at a lower humidity. And I said, well, it would really be much, much better if it weren't that way and it were out in the open and we could see it. And thankfully, after they studied it and realized that it was stable enough, they consented, and so it's on view that way so that you can really get right up to it. Please don't touch it, but you can get very close. And when you get up close, that's an X-ray showing the join, but when you get up close, you can see all these little tiny rectangles, which are patches. So this thing was cast, it's cast out of solid bronze. The red lines indicate the pieces. So it was cast in 5 separate pieces because it would be really a colossal task to try to cast this in a single piece. So it's cast in 5 separate pieces. They're then joined together. But in the casting process, there were some defects and the surface is not quite right. And rather than gathering up all the fuel you would need to melt it down and try again, they just took little sheets of bronze and cut them to the right size and hammer them into place to give it a better finish. I talked earlier about Poseidon Hippios, and there are a number of objects upstairs that show horses and horsemen, and these are, especially this object, we're getting a little bit speculative. So we're in the 8th century BC, and in the 8th century BC, we don't have any clear representations of Poseidon. I told you the earliest are from the 6th century BC. But we know we have references to Poseidon as early as the Mycenaean period, so several centuries earlier than this. So we know he was around and people were interested in him. And it's possible that objects like this that refer to horses may be connected to Poseidon, particularly ones like this that have paintings underneath the horses that look a lot like fish. There's a better example at Risdi, but unfortunately it was not in good enough condition to travel. But sometimes they're quite clearly fish underneath the horses, and if you have fish connected with horses, I think you can make an argument at least that we're talking about Poseidon. And just a reminder, again, this is not in the show, but this is totally unambiguous. This is Poseidon with his trident riding a horse, and he's labeled. So Poseidon definitely could be a horseman. Again, a little bit of speculation. We have these great black figure vases that are produced in the 6th century BC that archaeologists creatively call horsehead amphorae because they have a horse head on one side and a horse head on the other side. And scholars have debated for some time about what these mean. Is it just because the vase painters were interested in horses, or does it go further than that? Occasionally you get a very unusual one like this from the Indiana University Art Museum, where you have the horse head and on top of it you have a dolphin. So just like on the horse Pyxis, we have this curious combination of a horse and a sea creature. And that, I think, suggests a connection to Poseidon. And to take it one step further, occasionally you get a vase like this that looks like a horsehead amphora on one side, but then has a man's head on the other. And so that may well be Poseidon. I should add, because I see Jennifer Niles in the audience, and I think Jennifer thinks these are connected to Athena. And Athena can be called Athena Hippia. And there is a vase very similar to this that has a horse head on one side and a woman's head on the other side. So it may be that both of them are being worshipped. Again, it's a little bit of speculation. I tend toward Poseidon, but there's an argument that could be made for Athena as well. We also have votive offerings that I think would be suitable for a water god. Again, we don't know for sure whether these were dedications to Poseidon or, in this case, Neptune. These are Roman in date. But this is this great group of little tiny lead fish. These are all also from the Getty Museum. And from where you're sitting, you can tell that they're fish. But when you go upstairs, you can look closely and you can see how detailed they are, and that there are a number of different species of fish. And people who know more about fish than I do have studied them and said, these are all fish that live in the coastal waters off of Italy. The kinds of fish that fishermen in antiquity would have been looking for, and therefore perhaps the kinds of fish that they might make models of to thank a god for a bountiful catch, or in hopes for a bountiful catch. And these are of lead, so you can imagine if you want to dedicate them to a sea god, it's pretty easy to toss them into the sea and they'll sink to the bottom, and you can think at least that the god has accepted your offering. We have other little doodads like this that represent fish and sea creatures that would have been suitable as offerings. And then occasionally we see Poseidon himself actually receiving an offering. And we'll zoom in on one of these. This is this great red figure Stamnos from Toledo that's on the banner outside. And here, again, it's unambiguous. Here's Poseidon, and he's got his trident. There's a woman across from him that must be his wife, Amphitrite. They're each holding a fiale, a little libation bowl, and receiving an offering from this winged deity, who I think is probably Nike, or Nike, the goddess of victory. Again, this is right after the Persian Wars, when they've done so much to help the Athenians to victory. Others might say this is Eris, or Iris, the messenger god who pours out nectar for the gods. And then we're moving now into the last section of the show. I talked at the beginning about how some objects can be equally at home in a section on myth or cult or daily life. This is one where quite clearly we're looking at daily life. Down here at the beginning, we have these two fishermen pulling in fish in a net. And they've got a basket back here where they're going to put the fish after they catch them. We've got a guy in a boat up here. So that's daily life. But then here in the center, we have these two people flanking an altar, and there's a flame on the altar, so this is a burning offering that's being made. And just beside them is this great treasury building. It has this cage on the front to keep safe the offerings that are made to the god. And if we're not sure who the god is, we see right here a pillar, you can see the detail, with a dolphin diving alongside it, just like the dolphin diving alongside our statue upstairs. And this is probably a little bit later than our statue, even the 3rd century perhaps. So this is a sanctuary of Neptune right by the sea. And so we're seeing cult and daily life together in a single image. And so from there we transition to the section on daily life. And here I like to tell people that we're getting into a place where the ancient world is perhaps not so different from ours, right? We've talked about all these myths that seem like fantastic tales, and we've talked about making offerings to the gods, and that's not stuff that most people do anymore. But lots of people, maybe not in Hanover in January, but in Tampa in January, lots of people are out fishing and out on their boats and eating seafood. And so there are some senses where we're not so far away from the ancients. Some things have changed very much, and other things have not changed so much at all. This is one of my favorite quotes in the show. This is what some scholars have said is the earliest surviving recipe from ancient Greece. And it's a pretty simple one, and I'm not sure if that's exactly what the artist had in mind. I think not, because I don't think this is a ribbon fish. But you can see what he's doing. He's about to butcher this fish. He's already butchered another fish whose head maybe is down here, and here are the slices of fish, and he's getting ready for a big fish dinner. And on the other side of the cup, it's upside down here, but he's carrying a giant tuna. And then we have objects like these, where there can be no doubt at all that these artists were intimately acquainted with the creatures of the sea, right? These lobster claw, this is called an ascos, it's a little oil vessel. It's just the size of a lobster claw. It looks exactly like a lobster claw, and you can imagine that they may have even had an actual lobster claw and made a mold out of it and used that mold to make their vase. And similarly with these cockleshell vases. And then we get fish plates where, again, they seem to know what they're painting, right? These are actual fish. Again, ichthyologists have studied these and identified all the fish, and they're real fish that live in the Mediterranean and lived in the Mediterranean. And these all have this little depression in the center, which is probably meant to hold dipping sauce for the fish, and the fish arrayed around it. Occasionally you get an unusual one like this, where they've replaced the fish with a woman's head, a couple of heads. Or this one, even more unusual, this is the only one I know like this, where instead of a fish, they've got this boat and these rowers. And that's sort of the other aspect of daily life connected to the sea. So we have seafood on the one hand and fishing to get those fish, and then we also have seafaring. And I think Bill Murray is going to tell us a lot more about that tomorrow. We see other creatures from the sea like octopi. Sometimes they're in connection with boats. And then sometimes we have objects like this that look a lot more humble. This is certainly not the most beautiful object in the exhibition, but it's very, very interesting because it has a painted inscription on it. So there's the inscription here. Here's a drawing of the inscription. And here's a translation. So the best garum is the Roman word for fish sauce, fermented fish sauce. The best garum made from mackerel, a product of Scaurus from the shop of Scaurus. So that's kind of interesting because we have some connection to an actual individual. But it became much more interesting when archaeologists discovered a villa in Pompeii that had mosaic floors that had vessels in them with the same inscription. So there's a G and an F and an S and a C, just like up here. And the inscription is almost verbatim what we find on our vessel and on a number of other vessels that have been excavated from Pompeii. And so this guy was a fish sauce merchant who did so well for himself that he then built a villa and decorated it with mosaic floors with images of his product. And then we get these beautiful glass vessels. These are from the Corning Museum of Glass. I say vessels with reference to these two. So the mouths are pinched shut, but the tails are open. And you can fill these up with some sort of liquid, something pretty valuable, I think, and pour it out a little bit at a time. We also have a mosaic made out of glass. So this must have been part of a much larger wall decoration that showed fish swimming across the wall. We see fishermen in action. So here's a detail from that mosaic that we saw earlier. Here's an African red slipware bowl that shows fishermen in action with very, very large fish, and also a sea goat. So we have sort of daily life and myth, again, crossing paths, coming together. We have fish hooks that survive from antiquity. So again, some things change, some things remain almost the same. We have these great models of ships in lots of different forms. This one is my favorite. It has the helmsman back here. You can see the prow of the ship with the eye on it, as so many ships had in antiquity, and the prow. It has a hole here, which you can see easily. This is for filling the vessel. What you can't really see in the image is that there's also a hole right here. So you can fill this thing up, and then you can make a great show out of drinking. It'll pour out in a stream from just behind the helmsman's head. We even have this very rare representation of a ship being built. So you have the ship here and these two guys within it with hammers and chisels, and two guys outside ripping planks, probably for something else because it looks like the keel is already complete in this case. Here's one more. This is not in the exhibition, but just to show you a comparison. This is something that we hardly ever see in antiquity because shipbuilders were not the most celebrated people in antiquity. They were important, but it wasn't something that artists often celebrated in their work. And here, an image from Bill's chapter that talks about how ancient ships were constructed. And then this great photograph of what's called the Olympios. This is a replica of an ancient trireme, the type of warship that made Athens the supreme power in antiquity. And you can see it. There's the eye that we saw on the vessel. Here's the bronze ram that does the damage. So you have all these guys rowing full speed, and we ram into another ship. And as I said, we'll hear a lot more about this from Professor Murray, I think, tomorrow. But I want you just to keep this in mind when you look at this great vessel from Cleveland. This is called a dinos. It's a mixing vessel for mixing water and wine. The Greeks didn't drink their wine straight. They had to mix it with water, and so they needed a great big bowl with a great big opening. And in this case, they have decorated it with ships sailing around the inside. Here's a detail, and you can see how similar it is to the trireme that we just saw. And if you think back to Homer and how he describes the sea, he talks about the wine-dark sea. And so if you imagine this vessel filled up with wine, water and wine, to this point, it will look like these ships are plying the wine-dark sea. So it's sort of a visual pun that the artist is making. And this is, again, one of those vessels that works on multiple levels and would fit into multiple aspects of the show. And if you read this quote from Timaeus at the bottom, he talks about the way that a symposium, a drinking party, relates to the sea. So he tells us there's a house that's called the trireme because there were these guys who were having their symposium. They got so drunk that they supposed they were in a trireme, sailing through a dangerous tempest. They became so befuddled as to throw all the furnitures and fittings out of the house as though at sea, thinking that the pilot had told them to lighten the ship because of the storm. So they perhaps had a little too much to drink, but it's this great analogy between the symposium and the sea. And with this vessel, it even goes a little bit further because the top of the rim is also painted. And on the top of the rim, we have these alternating scenes of chariots and battles. Sometimes the battles are between warriors, sometimes, as here, they're mythological ones. So this is Heracles battling against the Nemean lion. And so we have this connection between the symposium and the sea, and now we're about to enter into a connection to the world of myth. And you can imagine if these guys were so drunk that they thought they were in a ship at sea, they could also easily think that they were reliving the exploits of these mythological heroes. And if we look again, here's one that may be familiar to you. We saw this vessel earlier, which shows Theseus slaying the Minotaur. It's the same thing that we see here. And with this one, we even connect back to Poseidon. This is a complicated tale, but I'll give you the very, very brief version, which is that there was this famous king Minos, who's the son of Zeus, so Poseidon is not inclined to like him. Minos is supposed to sacrifice his best bull regularly to Poseidon to make sure that Poseidon will give him calm seas so he can maintain his empire at sea. And at one point, Minos decides he's not going to sacrifice this bull. Poseidon, of course, is not very happy about this and retaliates by causing Minos' wife, Pasiphae, to fall in love with this bull. And you may know that Minos had this great craftsman who worked at his palace, Daedalus, and Daedalus created this contraption that allowed Pasiphae to satisfy her desires with the bull, with the result of this horrible Minotaur. So this goes back to myth and also to cult, that Minos was not paying proper cult to Poseidon. And the only way that this vicious cycle could end, I should add that in order to keep the Minotaur happy, Minos then has to get all of his subject states to send young men and young women to be sacrificed to the Minotaur. And the only way that this ends is by Theseus, the heroic son of Poseidon, sailing in his ship from Athens and actually slaying the Minotaur, which we see here. So with this vase, we come full circle. And with that, I will end. So thank you very much. Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to take questions if there are any.
Yes, sure. Notice upstairs, they had drinking bowls, and then they had bowls with handles. What did the single-handed mug versus
Well, there's a shape that we call a kiathos that looks a lot like a cantharos. It has a great big handle, but it only has one handle instead of two. And it's made at the same time as a lot of the vessels upstairs. We just don't happen to have one in the exhibition. Yeah. Yeah. You could have one handle or two handles or no handles, and occasionally three handles. Any other questions? Yeah.
Do you know how the Tampa Poseidon got from where you said it was in England to Tampa?
No, I haven't closed that gap. So my thinking is that Mr. Anson went on the grand tour like so many people did in the 18th century and purchased it in Italy and brought it back home. We know that Nolkens was working in Italy at that time. And we know that Anson sold his collection at auction in 1842, and the statue is listed in the auction catalog. But I have not found the results of that sale where it says to whom it was sold. One scholar suggested to me that some of the things were sold but then stayed at Shugborough Hall, the home of Anson. But even then, I don't know how it then got to this gentleman called Anthony Raine, who sold it to Spink & Son in London. So if anybody has the answer, please tell me. Yes?
Do you have a sense of when the Greek alphabet was invented? Because I presume these stories were passed over.
Yes. Scholars argue about exactly when it was invented. I think the Homeric epics, most people think were written down in the 8th or 7th centuries BC.
So before that's verbal.
And even after that, a lot of it is verbal. So we have all sorts of examples of written texts that disagree with one another and visual instances of myths, some of which we don't have at all in writing, like this Triton and Heracles, and some of which we have in writing, but it doesn't agree. Like there's a vase, the one in Vienna actually that I showed you, with Poseidon burying the giant with the boulder. All of our written accounts say the giant is called Polybotes, but that vase in Vienna says he's called Ephialtes. And I don't know if the artist was confused or he had a different version than we do, but it happens all the time. Yes?
So when did he lose his hands? Were they taken off because they weren't original?
Yeah, so I don't know when he lost them. I would imagine that when Mr. Anson acquired him, either he didn't have the hands or he had just gotten new hands, and perhaps Nolkens put them on. The reason this is such a nice clean cut and has this hole in it is so that a hand could be attached. And you can't see it in this image, but it's the same deal there. So probably he fell down, they broke off. When he was discovered, they needed to put new hands on because he wasn't really saleable like this. By the time Mr. Noble bought him, Mr. Noble is the collector who then, whose collection came to Tampa. So Noble bought him in 1956. By that time, he was more saleable like this than he would have been with those 18th century editions. But
You don't know how they disappeared.
no, I wish I had them. Mr. Noble also gave us a torso of Aphrodite that is missing her head. And we have drawings of her with her head and a couple photographs of her with her head. And the early scholars who looked at it said, it's an ancient head, it's just not the right one. And I have no idea where that head is now. Yes?
Do you know if there was a polychrome on the piece or painted or anything?
On the Poseidon statue? I think probably. Often these things were painted. That doesn't mean that he was completely painted, but Poseidon is often referred to as the dark-haired lord, so probably he had dark hair and a dark beard. Maybe the sea was blue. We don't know. There's no trace. There's no trace of it. No. Other questions? All right. Well, thank you again very much.